Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. As people continue to join and before we get started, let me briefly explain how this session will work. The webinar is going to begin shortly with presentations by our 4 featured speakers. The presentations will be followed by a question and answer session. At any time during the course of this webinar, you can type in your questions for the speakers using the question and answer function that appears when you hover over the top or the bottom of your screen. If your question is selected to be answered live during the Q&A session, we will unmute you so that you can ask the speaker your question directly. However, if you prefer, you may choose to submit your questions anonymously. And in this case, if your question is selected by the moderator to be answered, it will be posed to the speaker on your behalf. Please don't use the chat function to send us your questions, although you may use the chat box for comments, feedback, or to otherwise communicate with us, for example, if you're having any technical issues. Finally, this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available on the website of the International Land Conservation Network at landconservationnetwork.org and on the website of the European Land Conservation Network at ELCN.eu. With that, let me hand it over to Jim Levitt, Director of the International Land Conservation Network, to begin the webinar.
I'll unmute myself. Hello to all of you from around the world. My name is Jim Levitt. I direct the International Land Conservation Network, and I'm speaking to all of you today from my home in Belmont, Massachusetts, just outside of Cambridge, Massachusetts in the United States. I am really delighted to be able to help host this webinar focused on the extraordinary work done by our European friends on the Natura 2000 network. This is a network of protected areas covering a full 18% of the land and 10% of the marine waters across the 28 states of Europe. It is the largest coordinated network of protected areas in the world. This webinar will focus on the creation of the network, its evolving role in integrating private land conservation into the work of the network, and the result of that work for the biodiversity of Europe. The 4 speakers that we will hear today include Angelo Salsi, who is a senior manager at the European Commission. He's head of the Commission's LIFE program and the eco-innovation effort at the Executive Agency for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, or EASME, at the European Commission. Anton Gazenbeek, who is a steering committee member of the International Land Conservation Network, was here right at the beginning and is a incredibly enthusiastic and thoughtful member of our community of practice. Frank Vassen, who is a Belgian zoologist and ecologist, who is now the team leader in the nature unit of the General Directorate for the Environment at the European Commission in Brussels. And from Ireland, Michael Devoren, who lives and farms on the Burren in the west of Ireland. Michael is both a farmer and a distinguished member of the board of directors of the organization that helps to manage the Burren program. And he is a member of the steering committee of the Burren Life Project, co-financed by EU Life Nature Fund. So we've got a terrific lineup of speakers. We've got a very large number of participants today, just edging on 200. We're delighted about that. And with that, I want to ask my colleague, Tilman Disselhoff, to say a couple of words. Tilman is the director of the European Land Conservation Network and has also been with the International Land Conservation Network since its very beginning.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jim, for the introduction. I have the honor of welcoming all of the participants today to this webinar on behalf of Eurosite, the European Land Conservation Network. And let me start by saying I'm very, very grateful to the ILCN, to Chandni, to Sim for organizing this event, and I'm very glad continuing our transatlantic collaboration in this series of joint ILCN, ELCN webinars. I'm personally very excited about today's topic and the great presenters that you will be hearing from in a second. Firstly, because I think that a reflection on the history of the designation and management of Natura 2000 is very timely in the context of the new biodiversity targets with regard to protected areas. They were recently set out in the EU biodiversity strategy, but they still need to be operationalized there. And they're currently under discussion in the run-up to the new global biodiversity policy framework and the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this comes at a very good time because we have made great progress in the designation of protected areas, but we still need to expand existing networks around the world. And hopefully future efforts will benefit from the experience gained in this process. And we have a wealth of experience to share with you today among the four presenters. Secondly, I'm excited today because I strongly believe that this attempt to present such a global bureaucratic process, such as the designation of the European Network of Protected Areas, Natura 2000, with all its social and economic repercussions on land users and landowners, presenting that to a global audience will also allow Europeans, such as myself, to take a step back and look at it with new eyes, I hope. So I think it will hold lessons not only for people from outside the EU, but also for European practitioners and conservationists. So I'm very curious to hear from our presenters. I'm also very curious to and look forward to your questions today to today's panelists. And just as a reflection of how you will perceive the story, a success story, I believe, the story of Natura 2000. Thanks again to all the presenters for dedicating their time to this event pro bono. And with that, back to you, Jim.
Thank you. We now have 222 participants, which is a really tremendous show of interest in a very important topic. I'm glad to introduce my friend Angelo Salsi, who I've known now for at least 7 or 8 years. Angelo has been with the EU for nearly a quarter century now, and really has helped to pioneer the whole LIFE program, and in particular is highly knowledgeable about how it works and how it is financed. So Angelo, I know that the hundreds of people who have joined us today are anxious to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks to everyone. I must say that usually I'm not so nervous, but today, knowing that there are so many people from everywhere in the world listening to us, I'm a bit on my toes, if you want. The idea was that we have invented a machinery many years ago that possibly is certainly not unique in all its features, but it's probably quite unique in the whole in the global setup. And we have achieved, I think, quite interesting results. And we would like to share with you this perspective to allow other people from outside Europe to understand how our culture of European cultures operates in these kind of issues, and how certain things can be possibly either replicated or not done the way we did. So learning from the others, for me, it's always an interesting exercise. And the other thing is that I'm passionate about the idea that you have to look backwards to understand where you want to go in the future. And I didn't start doing this when I started growing a little bit too old, if you want. It's something that I have always had a passion for when I was much younger. So I will not bring you to the prehistoric times, but we'll try to bring you back in the 90s and starting with this, the next slide, with the setup that we had in place. We had two pieces of legislation in the European Union. what we call the Birds Directive, auto-explicative, trying to protect the birds, and another one, the Habitats Directive, covering all the other species and habitats. These two pieces of legislations, they set out the machinery to help us or to push us to give life to this network of protected areas, which is called Natura 2000. And currently it has the size that you see in the slide. So Jim already spoke about the percentages. We're talking about some 27,000 sites, more than 1 million square kilometers. And I put down, especially for the Northern Americans, a bit of reference. It's the size of Texas, California, and Pennsylvania altogether. So far from being a small piece of protected Europe as a contribution to the biodiversity strategy. The next slide. This is what it looks like. Now you can, let's make a parallel with today's situation. We're living in a pandemic. It's certainly not a very nice period and not something that we want to live through again. This picture looks a bit like a smallpox pandemic, but it's a positive pandemic. So let's try to see a bit with humoristic sense also that there are things that can become spread out as a virus, but they can be positive and not only the negative side. And you can see that all across the European Union member states, we have sites of different sizes and of different colors. Next slide. Now the basic question is how did we get there? So there was a process enshrined in these two pieces of legislation. I'll try to make it to simplify it as far as possible, because you know laws are always a rather intricate machinery. The actors were on the one side the European Commission that had the task of making sure that the rules and the laws were implemented, and the other side the member states. The member states, meaning Germany, Italy, France, and so on, they had to identify the sites and designate the site, but based purely on scientific criteria. So this is the first element to keep in mind, because it's an essential pillar of the whole logic. It's not a call for opportunistic designation. It was really based on the fact that these sites were indeed needed to ensure the conservation of habitats and species across Europe, and of certain habitats and species which are identified in the two directives. Once they had identified the sites, there were two parallel processes. A previous process for the birds, which was the identification and designation of special protection areas. The Birds Directive is an older piece of legislation, 1979, but based on the Habitats Directive, 1992, the second part of the site identification was then going through a more cumbersome or a complex mechanism. The member states did not designate immediately the sites like they did for birds, but they proposed them to the European Commission, and this had to be done by June 95. The European Commission then set up a mechanism which we call the biogeographical seminars, together with the European Environment Agency in Copenhagen. And these biogeographical seminars were sort of groups of people that were encompassing the European Commission, the Environment Agency, the member states representative, and the best or the most knowledgeable representative of science at the time and of civil society, NGOs typically. So we put them all in one room, and in those biogeographical seminars, we would discuss about the proposals made by the member states in order to identify if their proposal was sufficient and if the sites that they had proposed were indeed matching the requisites that were set in the legislation. To do that, obviously the member states, the first thing they had to do was to look into their length and see which sites indeed they could propose. So this is a work which is typically going through an inventory. And there were inventories ongoing across Europe. And the Little Life program, which is the financial instruments that the European Commission uses to support the environmental policies, including nature conservation, chipped in very strategically at the time through the financing of several of these inventories in very large countries like Spain, Italy, Portugal, and so on. So we used the money to enable member states to do what they were supposed to do by the law. A last bullet is how did this happen? Anton will tell you a bit more about the social context in which all this developed. Just to make it very simple, member states obviously had the duty of identifying these sites and proposing them, but then they could operate in the way they saw most fit in order to inform their society, typically the landowners. Some member states informed the landowners before proposing the sites to Brussels, others did not. Next slide. The biogeographical seminar are based on a concept which is also very specific to Natura 2000, is the biogeographical approach. Since everything is based on science and not on administrative borders, at least in terms of proposal and designation, we started off from the assumption that we had large areas of the European Union which were homogeneous in nature terms, and we call them biogeographical regions. So you see the Alpine, the Arctic, the Atlantic, the Black Sea, and so on. And we looked at the proposals coming in from the member states in view of seeing whether there was coherence in terms of numbers, quality, and geographical coverage and species and habitats coverage across that biogeographical regions. That's why the biogeographical seminars, they were called biogeographical, and that's why they were organized around one of those regions. So there would be a biogeographical seminars for the Alpine, or several seminars, one for the Mediterranean, and all the member states that had pieces of that biogeographical regions would then be called to these biogeographical seminars in order to discuss their contribution. Next slide. Once these biogeographical seminars came to a conclusion, the conclusion was this site and that site and that site is okay, that site doesn't seem to fit, but we are still missing this and that and that. The member states had homework to do, so they had to go back and identify and discuss internally these additional sites which they had to propose to complete their task. But then the Commission would adopt formally the list of sites that were initially proposed. Now they became official and they become sites of community importance, which would add up to the special the special protection area for birds. Later on, within 6 years, the legislation said these sites of community importance, for which, from the moment they were adopted, the member states had to avoid any deterioration. Then within 6 years, they would become special areas of conservation where action had to be done actively in order to manage them, to ensure the conservation objectives for which the site was designated. And the list of sites is updated once a year by the Commission. So it's a living and dynamic network. It's not something fixed and rigid. The next slide. There were certain conditions that I call them enabling factors at the time. To be fair with you, in today European Union, a process like that would be probably much more difficult to achieve, if we would ever be able to achieve such a macroscopic results. The first thing was that we had a very strong legislation, and a legislation which was strongly hooked to a scientific approach. So it was not a legislation that would make discount on economic calls, opportunistic calls, political elements. Of course, we are human and we know that behind the scene, these kind of factors, they come into play. But the main drive of all these biogeographical seminars, of the work of the Commission in verifying the list of sites and so on, was definitely a scientific approach. So a solid approach, and every time our approach was challenged and we went all the way to what we call the Court of Justice, which is the entity that in the European Union decides who is right and who is wrong in interpreting and implementing and applying European law, The battle was, do you have scientific grounds on which you can either contest or affirm what you are affirming? So it was really very interesting how the science behind was a strong drive. Then at the time, let's be honest, the European Commission and the European institutions in general had, in the eyes of the people of Europe, much stronger credibility. So I still remember when I joined the Commission in '94, I used to go back home in Italy, and my friends or my former classmates, they would ask me, "What are you doing, Angelo, nowadays?" "Well, you know, I'm working for the European Commission." And they would open their eyes like I was doing something really great. What a great opportunity I had. Nowadays, the reaction is not the same anymore. So the Europhilia or the Euro-positive attitude of our citizens of the time has turned, like in many other parts of the world, in a bit shyer approach and less trustful approach towards the European Commission. This trust that the citizens had in the European Commission allowed us to do things that probably today we would have a hard time in doing. We had a financial program supporting the process live, and it was tiny, but it was very instrumental. And we had a conducive social and political context. Just to give you an example, we had the capacity, our two commissioners of the time, so our ministers, Minister for Environment and Minister for Regional and Social Politics, to block sizable financing under regional funds mechanism for countries like France and Germany, simply because these guys had not sent in the list. So that's really a tough political act. And this was possible because the context was the context we had. So I think that this is possibly the last slide, and I might even fit in my time. Is it?
It is. It is just right on time. Thank you, Angelo. That was a very broad-ranging and understandable overview. Thanks for that very much. We are going to let you see these website addresses just for a second, and then we'll turn to Anton Gazenbeek, who has over 30 years of experience in European environmental affairs, both for the EU in the Parliament, as well as the Commission, and for other public and private entities at the national or European level. Anton, based in Belgium, was, as I said before, a key participant in early meetings of the ILCN and continues to serve us today with a lot of energy and enthusiasm and ingenuity. So, Anton, you're going to give a little more historical context on Natura 2000 before our next speaker. Please take it away.
Thank you, Jim. As Angelo showed us, the Natura 2000 network is vast, and depending on the country, a sizable part of it is privately owned. Did you notice? The farmer's cornfield is behind the Natura 2000 boundary. Next. How to reach favorable conservation status. There's no manual nor recipe in the directives. Article 8 leaves it to the member states to establish the most appropriate method. The fact that the players were figuring out what Natura 2000 means in practical detail while implementing it explains much of the confusion and mixed messages I will talk about. Next. An important message, especially for viewers outside of Europe. A big slice of the biodiversity in Natura 2000 is linked to the human use of land, mowed and grazed land, hedges, ponds, ancient olive groves, semi-natural fish ponds. Owners are users of land, farmers and foresters are thus natural partners in its conservation. Next. Natura 2000 acknowledges that. These are quotes from European Commission official documents and web pages. This philosophy was quite revolutionary for Europe back in 1990. The dominant conservation ideology tended towards pure nature and keep everyone, except biologists, out of the reserve. The notion of integrated management was only beginning to break through. The reality of building up the Natura network began with designation, the first phase from 1992 on, in which EU member states were supposed to choose future sites and send lists to the Commission. Next. The hillside above this village is a Natura 2000 area today. Calcareous grassland, in case you're wondering. You'd therefore expect the inhabitants to have a say in the process, to want to have a say. As the next slides will show, plenty of citizens felt they did not. Next. A word about the complaint on the left. The directives stipulate that site selection may only be based on ecological criteria, as Angelo said. It may not be influenced by socio-economic criteria. This principle was confirmed by our EU Supreme Court, the European Court of Justice in 1990s cases like Lappel Bank, and definitely this is one of the strengths of Natura 2000, but it did upset quite a few stakeholders. And looking to the right, yes, indeed, mistakes were made. But some landowners were being facetious, trying to wriggle out of it. I can remember back then visiting areas where beautiful grasslands were quickly plowed under and planted in crops before the government biologist was due to come visit. Species are well defined, but countries have different traditions of classifying habitats. The directive merely listed habitat types without definition, creating confusion, even among scientists. Eventually, the Commission published an interpretation manual of Natura 2000 habitats to clear the fog. Next. About the step-by-step on the left, some member states sent in minimal lists or dragged their feet and were wrapped over the knuckles by the Commission and the Court of Justice. A certain Angela Merkel, German Environment Minister at the time, was one of them in December 1997. These states were forced to do a second or even a third round of designation, which exasperated stakeholders who saw a renewed threat to their land. The biggest problem is on the right. The Habitats and Birds Directive don't contain any explicit obligation or procedure for public participation in establishing the Natura 2000 network. Some member states did consult, many did not. Italy confirmed to the letter of the directive, got its scientific experts to draw up a thorough list without involving anyone else. It was consequently the first member state, by a long shot, to send its sites to Brussels mid-1995. But was that wise? Next. These fears were not always correct, or they were exaggerated. There was a lot of unknowns and misinformation, sometimes stoked by entities with their own agenda. But there were own goals too. For instance, the Czech authorities at first reassured landowners Natura 2000 would not have an impact on their activities. Then it became evident that it would have an impact. Loss of trust, and once gone, hard to fix. One thing more, in many countries, conservation NGOs made their own lists of sites which fitted the ecological criteria and ought to be designated. They sent the so-called shadow lists to the Commission, which made good use of them to check which member states' official lists had big gaps. So this was a job well done. But it did not make the NGOs more popular with stakeholders who felt threatened by Natura 2000 and now saw their friendly local bird protection society as part of a secretive eco-conspiracy. Led to nasty accusations and confrontations, sadly. Next. In 2000, Natura 2000 was itself becoming a species under threat. Polarization everywhere. I remember that in certain rural areas, I would think twice before uttering the N-word in the local pub. In one German region where I was then working a lot, the agriculture ministry was deliberately sabotaging everything their environment ministry colleagues tried. Next. Natura 2000 had friends too, conservation NGOs, and the share of public opinion they mobilized. The European Court of Justice, which took a consistent stand in favor of the directives, and many more besides. I'll explain the words your nature for our money. As Angelo said already, in 2004, Commissioner Michel Barnier, who by the way is now the EU's chief Brexit negotiator, threatened to block payment of EU subsidies to member states which were not respecting their Natura 2000 obligations. Suddenly designations came flooding in, all right. Next. Yeah, this history looks grim, doesn't it? I admit, though, it was not all like this. Sweden contacted every landowner and initially even gave them the right to refuse to be part of Natura 2000. And Swedish management plans were drawn up for each landowner separately, outlining options which were then discussed one-to-one. But this was an exception rather than the rule. Next. Initially, member states tended to bundle Natura 2000 into their existing national systems of protected areas. From a private landowner perspective, a provocation. It means that not only do you hear out of the blue that your land is included on a Natura 2000 site map sent to Brussels months ago without your knowledge, to crown it, your national authorities are going to declare your property a strict nature reserve or part of a national park. A farmer I met in East Germany said it very colorfully. A farmer is a greedy by nature, but when he hears the word nature reserve, he sees red. This slide does show that Natura 2000 was very much learning by doing. Designating sites without informing landowners was legally right, but politically dumb. So we learned and adapted. Pragmatism, not stubborn ideology. Evolution and adaptive governance. That, I think, is one of Natura 2000's greatest strengths. Next. After designation, planning day-to-day management of the Natura sites is the second phase of the process. It's still not fully complete across Europe even today. The planning system shown here came about through carrots and sticks. The EU blocked payment of life funds to France, which thereupon unfroze the implementation of Natura 2000. In return, the EU Life Fund financed a project to develop and test this new system, now used all over France. It combines conserving species and habitats at the site with preserving the economic, social, and cultural activities practiced there. Critics might say there's a risk of lowest common denominator, of cautious, not bold outcomes. But at least the measures, contracts and payments, the monitoring, etc., are all agreed and accepted widely. Next. Although other countries also have formal public hearings and consultation procedures for the draft site management plans, landowners and users are often enough skeptical. Here are some recurring complaints. Maybe to conservation professionals, these look paranoid, exaggerated, absurd. But perception matters. Ignore other people's worldview at your peril, as plenty of recent referenda and elections have shown. Next. Partly in response to all this opposition, it dawned that Natura 2000's novel results-based philosophy gave scope to be more creative and less rigidly strict. A box of new tools aimed at private owners and users arose and spread. You can see the four main varieties. The two on the left are contractual relationships. Instead of banning or compelling by law, the more traditional methods to get stakeholders doing their bit for biodiversity in a protected area, the land user agrees voluntarily to something, and in return gets a reward. The two on the right are compensatory. You, landowner, are being made to sacrifice something for the greater public good. So the taxpayers, who collectively benefit from your sacrifice, chip in. Next. And yet owners and users are still not all on board. Broadly speaking, stakeholders in those parts of Europe which fit the description on the left tend to be more willing and able to cooperate with Natura 2000 managers. In intensive areas, this is less often the case, and conflicts happen. Two examples. In many Natura 2000 sites, low water tables from agricultural drainage affect species and habitats. So conservation authorities and NGOs want to raise water levels. But this has a big negative impact on farmland productivity. Conflicts break out. Win-win situations are hard to find in hydrology. And last year, a Dutch court ruled that nitrates in the air and water damage Natura 2000 sites. So all farmers around them must cut emissions, either by installing new technology, or reducing the number of livestock, or relocating altogether. These choices, not unreasonably, pose big problems for Dutch farmers who mounted the barricades. This so-called nitrogen crisis convulsed Dutch politics in 2019. Next. Resistance to purchase, see the left box, is real. For instance, in several districts.
Anton, I'm going to have to interrupt for just a second. You've got about a minute or two left, please.
Oh, okay. Well, this is the last slide.
Perfect. Perfect.
Okay. For instance, in several districts in Germany, where I worked on life projects, local farmers formed pacts where they swore that none of them would ever sell land to the conservationists. Owners and land users were particularly incensed if the conservation organizations are armed with taxpayer-funded purchase budgets and so able to outbid them for any piece of land. In Belgium, this situation was a direct reason the European Landowners Organization, ELO, was founded by Thierry de Lescaille in the 1990s. In its early years, it campaigned vigorously against public subsidies for conservation land purchase. Now ELO has attended and spoken at ILCN congresses, and ELO and Eurosite European Land Conservation Network together have embarked on a new life project to promote private land conservation in Europe. An example, after all this talk of Natura 2000 conflict, of how enemies can become friends. A good note to end on, I think.
Very good. Anton, thank you so much. That was a very thoughtful and comprehensive presentation. It is now my privilege to introduce Michael de Vuren from Ireland. Michael has a very interesting background. He lives and farms on the Burren in the west of Ireland, where his family has farmed for 6 generations. So that goes back quite a long time. He has a herd of 40 suckler cows on 110 acres and uses the Burren, I believe, for winterage, where the cattle are driven from summer pastures to the limestone uplands to graze on natural grasses in the winter months. Michael is also a co-founder of the Burren Program, a local partnership for sustainable farming in the Burren, which invests in Burren farmers to optimize and adapt farming systems. So again, this is a case of collaboration over time, which I think has interesting on the ground results. And that's what Michael has a chance to talk about now. Michael, the microphone is yours.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael de Vuren. I farm on the west coast of Ireland. It's here in the Burren. It is a rocky outcrop of karst limestone, which very rare flora grows on. 75% of the flora of Ireland can be found here in any of our farms. Mediterranean and alpine plants grow side by side, and nobody really knows why. A Cromwellian soldier who came here in the 1600s to conquer the Burren remarked, "Of this land, there is not a tree in which to hang a man, water enough to drown a man, or clay enough to bury him. Yet the grass that grows in tufts between the rocks is very nourishing indeed, and the cattle are the best in the kingdom." The Burren has always been a farmed landscape. I began to farm in the early 70s, and back then it was subsistence farming, like many developing countries. Some native breeds of cattle and sheep, some fowl and small animals to meet the market needs of that time. But we had just, Ireland as a country had just joined the EU, and that gave us access to a massive market. Europe was only 75% self-sufficient in food back then. And the Irish government and the EU funded and encouraged us farmers to fill that void in the market. Continental cattle began to appear across the Burren and throughout Ireland, and the suckler herd was begun. And of course, the suckler herd is the raw material for beef production. That continued right up to the 90s, and by the 90s, we had filled that market and had gone into oversupply. So quotas were put in place to prevent oversupply. Around that time, as we've already heard, SACs were introduced, or special areas of conservation. Our scientists and environmentalists were charged with deciding what areas were in and what the conditions for farming would be. Of course, we, the farmers, were never consulted. When we discovered what the conditions for farming were, we were irate. They were totally unsuitable to the kind of farming that we did here. But we weren't listened to. It was one size fits all. The environmentalists and scientists knew best. And that's how it was. We organised ourselves as a farm organisation under the national organisation IFA. We were the local branch of that organisation, Burren IFA. We challenged government that what was being proposed just couldn't work here, and it would literally prevent us from farming as we knew it. It would freeze the Burren in time. But to no avail. Fortunately for us, there was an agricultural scientist who was a native of the Burren, and he advised us we'd never be listened to, even though what we were saying was correct, until we got academia on our side. He introduced us to the Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture in the local university. And a student was granted to do a thesis on the impact of farming on the flora of the Burren. That student was Brendan Dunford. When Brendan arrived in the Burren, everything changed. Brendan was completely different to any academic we'd ever met before. He listened to us. Despite hundreds of books being written on the Burren, a farmer was never spoken to or farming never mentioned. Brendan understood from the very beginning the importance role that farming played in the management of the flora. He had that patience and endurance, and above all, the people skills to listen to us and talk to us. He crisscrossed the Burren for 4 years, spending countless hours in our homes, finding out little nuggets of information, going away researching them. And when he wrote his thesis, it proved categorically that the only way to protect and manage the Burren was to continue farming those ancient farming practices. Our academics and botanists sat up and listened now. One of their own ilk had proven what we've been saying all along to be an academic fact. But of course, we all realized that we couldn't do this on our own. So despite being arch enemies and bitterly fighting for the previous years, we came together with National Parks and Wildlife and the Department of Agriculture as equal partners to form a steering committee, which incidentally meets periodically to this very day to make sure the LIFE project delivers. We look for LIFE funding, which was granted, to come up with answers to the questions posed by Brendan's PhD. Brendan put a team of like-minded people together who challenged us, the farmers, to take back ownership of how the burn would be managed. Once again, we became architects of our own destiny. And that was the catalyst that drove us to get involved in this new environmental project. Quickly, we put trackways up the sides of hills to remote parts of our farms. We put back in place the ancient field systems which had fallen into disrepair. We cut the scrub, which is a woodland plant which is very invasive and colonizes the burn very quickly and prevents the light getting in and the flora growing. The burn team analyzed the rank grasses that we needed to graze off and created a grain-based ration with all the nutrients that was required for our animals to hoover off the rank grasses and deliver a pristine environment. Because of course we earn a large part of our income from the production of livestock all the time here in the burn. We couldn't afford to do this work on our own, so Brendan and his team co-funded this very necessary work, because of course it was a means to an end, and that end was to graze out the winterage properly and allowing the light so that the flora could reach its full potential. During this period, they put in place a special system to grade the fields, a scoring system. And the higher the score, the better the environmental value of each field. But that doubled up, because the higher the score, the better we grazed out the fields, the more money we could earn. And this was frightfully important to us as farmers, because it was extra income. There is no downside to the project that's going on here in the burn. And the reason there is no downside is this. National Parks and Wildlife are charged with managing this special area of conservation. They can't do it themselves. They need us, the farmers, to do this very necessary work for them. So they're thrilled. The Department of Agriculture from Pillar 2 of CAP co-fund the work that goes on here. They're thrilled because they can measure the environmental benefit from farming and justify to the auditors and ultimately the taxpayer the great work that's been done and the value for money. And we, the farmers, get our income. So it's win-win-win. And that's why the project is so successful. It's based on a 5-point template. And the 5 points can be used to manage environmental anywhere. Why is the area a special area of conservation? What has changed in the last 70 years to cause this environment to go into decline? How can we recreate the ancient farming systems using modern day technology to deliver pristine results? Put pilot projects in place, working with farmers to make sure that what you're doing is working. And finally, put a properly financed and resourced project in place to deliver for the farmers. This works anywhere. Here in Ireland, the other projects have followed our example. The Hen Harrier project is working to great effect. From a bird that was gone into decline is now back in large numbers again, using this template. Equally, in our rivers and streams, the Pearl Mussel scheme uses the same template to similar effect. There are EIPs right across Europe, all using this template to decide on best practice farming in their areas. And each autumn, in the month of October, to our winterage school here in the Burren, they come to learn from the mothership, as it were, what best practice is like on the ground. And this gives, we all learn from each other, but this also gives an important focus to new projects to learn and to realize that they too can develop an environmental project in their area. But where to from here? for farmers like the Burren? Well, Burren Bio Trust has already started that work by the education program online and in our walks and talks for us adults. And they go into the schools to educate our young people, take them out onto the winterages and show them the importance of farming in protecting and managing this unique and fragile landscape. But of course, the next generation are well educated, and many see the world as their oyster and want an off-farm job. They find it very difficult to have full employment far away and juggle that with farming in the Burren. Well, it's far away God sends, and I believe the coronavirus has a silver lining. You might well laugh, but this time last year, did any of us think we'd all be working from our homes? But we are. I believe that this is the ideal opportunity for farmers here in the Burren to have full-time employment elsewhere while working and living on their farm. Of course, there will always be full-time farmers needed to do this very necessary environmental work. And farming doesn't provide the same income as other occupations at the minute. This must be addressed to make farming competitive, to attract the next generation. In the past, my ancestors evolved to meet the market needs of their time. My generation has seen massive change, and we have been equal to that task. I am convinced, giving the proper financial support, that the next generation of young farmers will have learned from their ancestors and will evolve to meet the necessary means to protect the Burren with the LIFE project for many generations to come. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Michael. That was a terrific presentation. I think you may get a call from Netflix sometime to put this in a movie. You're so inspiring. We really appreciate that, and are so happy that you were able to join us this morning. I now want to ask Frank Vasson, who is the fourth and final, but certainly not the least of our presenters. Frank has been along for the ride with the ELCN also since the 2014, 2015, 2016 time period, and is someone who has very steadily worked to make sure that Natura 2000 and the LIFE program are working to contribute to Europe's biodiversity. So Frank, with that introduction, please take the microphone.
Well, Jim, thank you very much for these nice introductory words. And I'm a bit afraid after these three presentations that were so captivating. I must admit, I'm not such a good speaker. And the subject is perhaps a bit drier than all the interesting issues that we have heard so far. I really want to look on the impact of conservation. And the question that I'm going to ask is, did the Birds and Habitats Directive and Natura 2000 deliver? Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah, I think this has already been mentioned. Natura 2000 is based on two directives, the Birds Directive from '79, which is focused on bird species and their protection, and the Habitats Directive, which is then covering a whole range of other species, both animals and plants, mammals, reptiles, frogs, fish, and a lot of invertebrates, and the habitat types. And that was a rather innovative part of a directive, because never before has there been a specific protection system for habitat types. I should also mention that both directives have another component in Natura 2000, and that's the legal species protection. And it's important to look at that part as well, which was implemented, by the way, much faster than Natura 2000, because the member states just had to put this into national legislation. Whereas, as you have seen, the establishment of Natura 2000 was a much more cumbersome process and a much more tense process. And we are kind of still struggling with it. Another important element of both directives is that there is a reporting obligation. And in fact, the member states report every 6 years on the status and trends of all the protected species and habitats. And that is
My
basically
apologies.
our...
Frank, we are actually unable to see your video. Can you please? Oh, never mind. It just turned on. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
My apologies for the
it was
interruption.
frozen. Yeah.
Okay,
So just about, yeah.
thank you.
About the reporting, so this is basically our main information source about measuring the progress of the network and to see whether Natura 2000 and the species protection system have actually delivered. Next slide, please. Yeah, and if we take a look back into the past, look at the 30 years, I think there is one phenomenon that is quite clear in Europe, is that we had a very significant comeback of a lot of large bird and mammal species. And this is not just one species, this is a whole range of species. And we talk about large carnivores, large herbivores, a lot of raptor species, but also other species like the beaver and the otter. And what all these species had in common is that they were persecuted, they were hunted. Some of them were poisoned, or some of them were considered as pests for other reasons, eating fish or whatever, doing damages to buildings. And this protection regime actually under the Birds and the Habitats Directive is probably the single most important driver for their continental-wide comeback. So I think that's clearly a measurable and clear impact of the species protection part of the directive. And it's important to make that distinction, because if we want to look at Natura 2000, we need to look at this question as well and make a separation. But maybe just to mention as well that due to this comeback of wildlife, we are now increasingly confronted with the need to manage these populations, and we call this managing coexistence. This is about establishing systems where stakeholders are properly, where the damages are properly recognized, where they're compensated, and where appropriate prevention systems are put in place and financed. So this is a bit the reverse of the impact of the directive. It's that we now have additional challenges, but that's what we wanted. We wanted these species to come back, and I think it works. But it also shows that another important element of a directive is that we are still being challenged on this, and there is a lot of still ongoing requests from stakeholder organizations to change certain legal aspects of the directives, and in particular when it comes to protected species. And I think the wolf is the most challenging example we're faced with for the moment being. So let's now go to Natura 2000. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's the picture of Natura 2000 that you've seen already. And here you see some key figures of a network. It covers 18% of the EU land area and 9% of the EU marine area. And the two bar charts above are show the increase of a Natura 2000 land area and the marine area over the last 9 years, from 2011 to 2019. We don't yet have the figures for 2020. What you see is that already in 2012, the terrestrial area of Natura 2000 more or less leveled off, and we are considering nowadays that the terrestrial part is largely completed, whereas the marine part is still increasing, and there are still recognized gaps in the marine network. This is mostly due to the difficulties to identify the most important sites for certain marine habitats. So this is still ongoing, but just to say that due to this, I think we have to be aware that the network is still rather young. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is about just a quick explanation, especially for non-Europeans, how Natura 2000 works. In the first box, you see the two fundamental legal requirements that apply to all sites. The first thing to keep in mind is that a Natura 2000 site is not just about maintaining what is there. In fact, the sites are designed to make a significant contribution to the recovery or the maintenance of favorable conservation status. So whenever you talk about a species or habitat that is not already in a favorable conservation status, it means that for the network, for the sites in the network, member states need to look at measures that will improve the status of species and habitats in the sites. And that is done through the determination of conservation objectives and the implementation of measures which are then based on these objectives. And these are then, depending on the conservation status, it might be sufficient to maintain the current status, or there is a clear need to enhance, and this is of course restoration measures. The second important element of a network is that for every single site, there is a legal obligation for non-deterioration, which covers all the habitats and species at site level. So you might say that there is as many individual legal obligations thanks to Natura 2000 as there are individual species and habitats in Natura 2000 sites. So there must be, in principle, these are tens of thousands of legal obligations for non-deterioration. And that's the logic of a network. It creates a continental-wide safety network for species and habitats. So, and the first component I just mentioned is then the more voluntary one, which is forward-looking and making progress. I should also say that in the directive, there is no deadline for achieving the final result of favorable conservation status. So there's a lot of flexibility for the member states and the site managers, and depending on the available resources, to see how far they can progress. And of course, we would like them to do more, but this is very often a question of availability of resources. I should also mention that for the Natura 2000 sites, there are always situations where a plan or project, let's say a big infrastructure project, to take an example, might have a significant impact and deteriorate a site. This is possible under certain circumstances, and I don't want to go into the details here, it would take too much time, but keep in mind that there are very high levels of requirements for this. In fact, it must be an imperative reason of overriding public interest. And in any case, such exceptions always require compensatory measures so that the overall coherence of a network is not put into question. Next slide, please. Now we come to the key question. Did it actually work? What did Natura 2000 deliver? Well, there's a number of disclaimers I have to start with. First of all, it's still a rather young network. And I think that you've seen from the statistics, but also from the previous presentation, there is still some work in terms of completing the network on the marine part. Also need to keep in mind that some member states joined the EU much later than others. The latest one, Croatia, joined only in 2013. And there is perhaps a more interesting question. That's a bit of a scientific one. In fact, it's very difficult to distinguish what is due to the original quality of a site, because the sites have not been selected randomly, as compared to the Natura 2000 protection impact. So, and that requires some really specific approaches. You need to look at different differential trends inside and outside the network to really disentangle this question. There are also, unfortunately, still a lot of data gaps in the reporting by the member states, because this is not a cheap reporting. It requires quite significant resources if you want to have something that is quite representative for a given species or habitat covering a large geographic area. And then we also need to keep in mind that's a biological reality, that restoration is not always directly giving the results, and very often you can implement the measures, but it takes years, if not decades, or maybe even centuries in certain cases, before you can really see the conservation outputs. So with all these disclaimers, let's now look at some of the results. Next slide, please. Yeah, and in fact, we have two types of evidence. The first on the left, this is from the reporting by the member states. And here you see some statistics on the status and trends of habitats that are protected by Natura 2000. And actually, this is a bit difficult to read, but I would invite you to just look at the the dark red or brown part on the right side and the dark green one on the left side. And what it shows is that the higher the share of habitat in Natura 2000, the higher the likelihood is that it is not deteriorating, or as well that it is improving. So I think this is an objective evidence of the effect of a network, and this is due to the fact that not all habitats are equally well covered by the network. It also depends on the relative frequency and other factors, to what extent it is considered sufficient to, to what extent the coverage is being considered sufficient. And we have similar statistics for species covered by the Habitats Directive and for the bird species. And there it is actually quite clear that those bird species for which Natura 2000 sites are designated are overall doing much better than the other ones, many of which, in particular the common bird species in Europe, are still undergoing significant declines. So that is one type of evidence. And the other one that's more recent even, that's based on satellite information. And we start to use satellite information in a systematic way, but it's linked. There is a significant time gap before we can exploit the data. And for the moment, we have been looking at, in particular, at the evolution of grasslands, because grasslands are known to be those habitats that are the most threatened. Michael mentioned it by abandonment, but in some other regions also by intensification. And the first results of that exercise, and keep in mind, this is just for a 6-year period, it shows that between 2006 and 12, we are still losing grasslands, semi-natural grasslands in Natura 2000 sites. But to a rather limited extent, and in any case, these losses are on average 4 times smaller than outside of Natura 2000 sites. We have also seen that the main issue explaining losses of semi-natural grasslands in Natura 2000 sites is due to land abandonment. On the other hand, when we look at the situation outside, we see that it is mainly due to urbanization, intensification, or transformation into arable land. And finally, we've seen that some Natura 2000 sites and some big sites did not deteriorate. And when you look at the management system that were put in place, it was quite obvious that the non-deterioration was directly linked to the fact that good management systems had already been installed and were successfully working on these sites in 2006. Now, in the meantime, we have done a lot of progress, but we are not yet able to measure it. We have, of course, over the last 20 years, also thanks to the LIFE programs, a lot of evidence for improvements in the conservation of species and habitats, which are always limited to the project areas or just a bit wider, but not yet at the biogeographical level. And why is this so? Well, because the investments that we have been able to provide through different EU funds, to national funds, sometimes to private funds, to the management and restoration of Natura 2000 have not been sufficient yet to cover the needs. Next slide, please. And so that's one of the key messages we need to give, is that we need to step up investments. I would also like to mention in this slide that last year we published a study which looked specifically at successes. We wanted to see what was explaining successes and how this information could be used to scale up the successful implementation. And the study that was published, it came up with 4 main conclusions. The first one is that species and habitats that have shown improving trends were mostly those that tended to be concentrated within Natura 2000. Second conclusion was that the conservation measures that contributed to improvements of species and habitats were actually mostly taking place in Natura 2000 sites. So especially so for habitat types. Another finding was that these measures were also beneficial to more widespread species. And this is obviously linked to the fact that the sites themselves are already higher quality sites comparative to the average European landscape. So there is clear evidence that the sites have been well selected, that they are generally quite well designed, and that they have a functional source area for biodiversity beyond those species and habitats for which they have been initially designated. And then, well, this sounds a bit like an evidence, but I think it's important to keep in mind that the main impact of Natura 2000 was to stimulate the required conservation measures for the habitats and species through the access of funding. So it created the systems to fund, especially LIFE, but also other funds such as the Rural Development Program, to development of management plans, to the provision of staff for the management, to the establishment of conservation objectives and measures, to legal enforcement, and in particular to stakeholder engagement. And where all these conditions are fulfilled, Natura 2000 works successfully, but we are not yet there. Next slide, please.
One more minute, and then we'll have to move to questions.
Good. So actually, this is my conclusion slide. Actually, so when you look at all this evidence, the conclusion is that the effectiveness of a network is determined by the site's coverage of habitats and species, by the investments into management, and by the ability to reduce pressures. There are still implementation gaps that we need to catch up. In terms of legal enforcement, it doesn't fully work, but also in terms of financing and stakeholder engagement. We have a lot of local successes, but they're insufficient for the moment to reverse the overall trends. And we still, unfortunately, we also have a number of sites that are just too small. Formally, we have a sufficiency, but we see that there are sites that are too small, they're difficult to manage, they're subject to high external pressures, or they're not sufficiently well connected. Next slide, please. So just to say that we are aware of these deficiencies, and it's thanks to this awareness that we have been designed the new biodiversity strategy for 2030 and its main targets, which are linked to the completion of a protected area network. We are now talking about the need for 30% of land to be protected. It's not only Natura 2000, also national protected areas. 10% to be strictly protected. That includes both Natura 2000 and national protected areas I mentioned. There is a need to step up the effective management of all protected areas. And there is a need to step up restoration and investments into restoration. So now I stop here. I thank you for your attention, and we still have time for questions. Thank you.
Frank, thank you. That was a very comprehensive presentation, and I think those of us who don't live in Europe are inspired by what you've done so far, and really looking forward to see what you can do over the next decade or so. Let me open this to questions. We have a fair number of questions in the question and answer box, and I invite you to add whatever you want to. We have about just a little bit less than 20 minutes left. But I want to say all of these presentations were fascinating, and we know that because more than 230 people are still on paying attention to what we're saying. So that is terrific. So I'm going to open it up with a very short question to Michael Devoren, which is, Michael, how far back, what year did your family start 6 generations ago working in the Burren?
Well, that's a difficult question. There's a family tree done that goes back to the 1400s to a law school. And when Brehon law ended, the Daverans got land. So it would be back around the 1500s. And we can trace our lineal back for 6 generations here in this particular farm.
Well, that is a very deep love for the land then, that goes back almost 600 years. So that's really, really impressive. Okay, so the first question that I have from the crowd, I'm going to combine 2 questions. Laura Johnson, I'm going to ask you to ask your question live if you like, and then I'm going to add one more that's very similar to it. So Laura, can we turn Laura's microphone on, please?
Hey, Good to see everybody. And those were fantastic presentations. I really, really enjoyed them. Although I don't think I've ever seen Angela with a tie on, so that sort of unnerved me. My question relates to how you all are thinking about including climate change assessment and resilience issues within the, generally Nature 2000, but 2000 sites, but obviously with the 30 by 30 biodiversity strategy. And I was thinking in particular, as at least some people on the call know, that the Nature Conservancy has led this effort in the US to do this resilient landscape mapping for the entire United States. And I wondered if there was anything similar happening in the EU.
And
Thanks.
so the complementary question is from an anonymous attendee who asks, given the better understanding of how climate change is driving changes to habitats and species distribution, has the Natura 2000 network been reevaluated to ensure resilience in the face of a changing climate? So who'd like to take that question first? Frank, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. It's indeed an issue which we are discussing intensively. I mean, first of all, the biodiversity strategy, how does it reply to the challenge of climate change? I mean, clearly, this shows that we need better connected areas and more space for nature, so that species will be able to migrate and adapt to the conditions. We are fully aware that there will be changes, and that there will be changes, for example, in the distribution of species and habitats. And the directive basically recognizes that as well. And there is a clear distinction in the directive between those things on which you might need to adapt because there's nothing you can do about them, and those things on which you can intervene and where you should do something. So these two things shouldn't be mixed up. The other important point is when we talk about restoration, there is a clear also an opportunity to combine nature protection and climate adaptation and mitigation by prioritizing certain restoration measures. And both when it comes to the protected areas and the restoration targets under the strategy, we are currently, well, we are not mapping or not yet mapping, but we are discussing with the member states on the criteria for additional protected areas and for priorities for restoration. And clearly climate adaptation and climate mitigation and the need to restore carbon-rich habitats will be very high on the priority list in this context. With regard to the question on the flexibility of Natura 2000, well, this is a recurrent question. I think it is nevertheless important to keep in mind that it's not the high biodiversity areas that change. It is the distribution of species and habitats over a wider range that will change. So we rather tend to consider that it should not affect fundamentally the location of the sites, but it might actually affect the species and habitats present in a given site. And there's already signs of this. And what we also see is that when you see colonization of species towards more, let's say, northern areas, they first appear in the protected areas. And that's actually the purpose of a protected area. So I think it already works, but we can certainly do better by improving the connectedness of the sites.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Let me move on to another question from Carlos Munoz Brenes from Costa Rica. He's the Director of Social Science and lead of the Impact Evaluation Initiative for Conservation International. And his question is a generic question that we're asked, which is there a way to get a copy of Frank Vassen's presentation? And the answer is yes, in two ways. First of all, the entire presentation is being recorded and will be posted on the ILCN website, and I believe perhaps on the ELCN or Eurosite website as well in the next couple of days. It takes a little while to process, and we're coming up to a holiday in the United States, so it might not be until next week. But secondly, if you email any of us we will make sure to get you a copy of that with the permission of the author. So I will give you one email address that kind of works for all of these presentations, which is raustin, AUSTIN, at lincolninst.edu. That's Robin Austin's email address. She has been collecting all this information, and we will make sure to get the permission of the owners to re-release these. But I think, Frank, you can just nod if it's okay if we redistribute your presentation. All right, so we'll actually probably put that on our website as well. And we're really here for everybody to share this information. So that's great. Another question that I will ask from Patrick Cody. At 18% protected, how does Natura 2000 relate to a 30% biodiversity goal? That is 30 by 30. And what is the compliance status of the European states to the Biodiversity Convention goals, to the goals that'll be reviewed at the COP15, I think, which is going to be held in Kunming, China in May of 2021. Who wants to try to answer that one, if any of you?
It's always Frank.
Yeah, well, Angelo, do you want to say something, or should I answer?
I'm not going to go to China, so.
Nor do I, unfortunately.
And you know.
Yes. No, I can answer certainly on the first question on the 18% versus the 30%. As I mentioned, I mean, there is a formal process of identifying sufficiency of a network. And as concerns the terrestrial part of a network, with a very few exceptions, and I don't think they will really change a lot, maybe 0.1% or 2%, we consider that the terrestrial part of a network, as far as the species and habitats for Natura 2000 are concerned, is complete. This is certainly not the case for the marine part of a network, where we are currently at about 9%, and we still have significant areas in the marine part of the the marine territory of the member states where there is no Natura 2000 sites. And so there is certainly a need to, first of all, complete the marine Natura 2000 network. But the strategy, it's not about only Natura 2000. When it comes to the protected area target, it is about national protected areas that exist. It is about additional protected areas. And it might also include some other concepts such as OERCMs, which is the other effective area-based conservation measures. And here we come back to the subject of private land conservation. As far as the protected areas are concerned, we know that looking at the current reporting from the member states, we are at maximum 26% of the EU covered by protected areas. However, we are not yet sure, and this is a process, we need to clarify that in the coming year or in the coming 12 months, whether all these protected areas really fit the definition of protected areas, because this is really national legislation and we have a huge variety of sites, and some of which are very clearly focused on biodiversity conservation, some of which are temporary sites, and that's also a relevant question, and some of which are permanent sites but might not be very much focused on biodiversity, or maybe not at all. So we really need to clarify that. And it's only then that we can, let's say, see what would be needed in terms of additional areas to be designated to achieve the 30% target. And I would not expect that we have that knowledge before, let's say, 12 months from now.
All right, thank you. I now have a question from Caterina Palombo, who has a question for Angelo. Caterina, can we turn your microphone on, please, and have you ask the question? Are you there, Caterina? You're muted. All right, I will ask the question.
Yeah, yes.
Oh, there she
I'm
is.
here.
Okay, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have this question because I'm working in Italy and I'm trying to work with the land stewardship also in Italy. And I met also Dr. Salsi 2 years ago, maybe, I think, in Comondo. I want to ask if it's possible to, yes, to train and to apply, also to give the possibility to create a land trust in Italy, and then use this land trust for the management of the Natura 2000 areas, because we have in some regions we have problems because we have the management plan, but we don't have a management organization, and many region has a problem with the monitoring also, and then for the reports and so on. Maybe the land trust could be a very useful opportunity for organization that also already work in our country, in our village, and also because I think that this kind of organization is very useful for a stakeholder engagement in with the local community, with the local people that work and study in our countries.
All right, Katerina, let's see what Angelo has to say. Angelo,
Yes.
your answer.
Yeah, Katerina, the reply is definitely yes. It's a long time that Tilman, Anton, Jim, I, and many others are trying to push the Europeans to work on this more broadly on this concept of land trusts, and that as a mechanism to involve more private landowners and private land managers into the machinery of conserving nature. So yes, you have already a person in the panelist set that could be your reference person, Tilman, who is one of the people running a project exactly for this purpose at European level. And be my guest, obviously, if you want to set up any project under the auspices of life that could foster this kind of approach across Italy. Why not?
Very good. Very good. All right, I have
And
one more question.
If I may quickly add to that, just Caterina, you can also reach out to our Italian members of the ELCN, specifically Francesco Marcone of the WWF Oasi and Stefano Picchi of Bologna University. They are organizing managers of privately protected areas in Italy and also offer training, and they will continue to do so in the next years. And I am certain that they will be happy to work with you together.
Very good. Very good. All right, last question for the day from Andy Bleasdale. I will read it, Andy, just because we're running out of time.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
You're very welcome, Katerina. Thank you for your interest. So Andy asks of Michael, great presentation as always, Michael, inspiring stuff. Would you have advice for farmers in other areas as to how to position themselves so that a Burren type model can be delivered in their area? What do they need to do in practical terms? So Michael?
Oh, very big question. Well, thank you for that. The answer to that is, I suppose, use the Burren template. Identify what is special in your area. Why has it gone into decline? What needs to be done through farming to recreate the conditions for the land to rejuvenate itself? Convince the farmers to buy into such a program, work with them to ensure that happens through a pilot project, and then put the funding in place to deliver a scheme. The farmers need to work with the environmentalists because none of us can do this on our own. We need each other. And that's the strength of any ground up approach. The farmers will deliver what's asked of them, but the environmentalists must know what it is that they want delivered.
Very good.
Then you find another PhD.
Find another person like Brendan who's got that enthusiasm and that ability to listen that really created magic in Ireland, I think.
And might I say, Andy Bleasdale is a great guy in national parks and wildlife. He is a leader in his field out there, and he's getting academia on that side, working with farmers all the time. He's doing a wonderful job. just as well. He worked well with us in the Burn, and he's always supportive. He never misses a steering committee meeting. And that's very important because farmers buy into that kind of system where everybody's working together.
Very good. Very good. Good to know. And thank you, Andy, for that great question. All right, I am going to adjourn this meeting. It has been going on for an hour and a half at least. And we've just had terrific presentations, great questions, great participation. And we have used, even in the pandemic times, the ability of the internet to link us all live from Italy, the United States, Ireland, Germany, Belgium, and so many other places. I can't even count them, but those are the ones that I can recall of speakers. So to all of you across such wide geographies in Costa Rica, thank you so much for your participation. We look forward to seeing you again on another ILCN, ELCN webinar. For those of you in North America and the United States, happy Thanksgiving. And to the rest of you, we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Have a good afternoon or evening, wherever you are.